Timothy's second question and the last question of the episode is, can you explain 1 Timothy 2, verse 10 through 15?
No, not in a Q&A. This whole passage, this is about women, not teaching and being silent and, in church. This is, of course, the passage is related to the larger women in ministry, women in the church issue. Honestly, you can argue both sides pretty well from the text. Now, for people who have sort of followed my website, my blog for any amount of time, years ago I did a blog series on the women in ministry issue with John Hobbins. John and his wife are both pastors. And so I told John, I wanted to do this, and I said, your job is to make me care about the issue. Because, again, my view is this is so far down my list of things to really care about because I see ambiguity in the text at key points. And that is what allows us to argue both sides well from the text. So I said, John, if you can make me care and make me feel like I need to like land somewhere and then diss the other side, go ahead. But he failed. I still feel the same way about it, but it was fun. Again, I tend to not get terribly invested in issues where positions get stalled in textual ambiguity. To me, they become, by definition, issues of conscience. And that's really, for instance, what I would tell my daughter. If I had my daughter come up to me and say, hey, I feel God is calling me into the ministry, I would say, well, that's between you and the Lord. I can't honestly, say that I'm sure you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. I don't know. But do well and be a blessing. That's exactly what I would tell my daughter. Do the best you can, be a blessing, have a good ministry. This is between you and the Lord. So when it comes to 1 Timothy 2, this little subset of the women in ministry issue, the passage itself has a few workable possibilities, some that might seem better than others, but there's no one view that renders all of the other possibilities fundamentally incoherent and indefensible. So again, you're dealing with a difficult passage that has certain ambiguities about what's in the text. Now, to illustrate, I'll make one exegetical observation about 1 Timothy 2, 10 through 15, and I'll use that as a basis for a position. In other words, I'm going to pretend here. This is a thought experiment for the sake of the question of the podcast. So I could look at the passage and say, well, Paul in this passage really makes his judgment deeply personal. He says, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over man. Rather, she's to remain quiet. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. If we go back into the passage, again, just looking at that, it looks like, when he says, I do not permit, it looks like Paul is making a personal argument. And the exegetical point is that, Paul uses the first person. I wouldn't do X, Y, or Z. And I could interpret that and say, well, that means his advice may be just that, a personal preference based on the rationale that he gives about Genesis. But, Paul conveniently leaves out that the man sinned willfully. He's concerned that the woman, was deceived and not the man. But what he leaves out the fact that Adam sinned with a high hand, so to speak. He sinned with full knowledge. So if Paul's point is that women shouldn't teach because they fall victim to false teaching more than men, why not flip it around and say men are more dangerous to have as teachers because they can turn around and deceive people deliberately? Well, he doesn't do that. The fact that Paul leaves something so obvious out of the discussion suggests to me that this is a personal preference born of some situation that influenced his thinking, or perhaps it's the familiar model of Judaism. He was a Pharisee and all that. At any rate, I could argue that the passage can be read as 1 Corinthians 7, for example, is read, where Paul just tells people where he's at. Hey, I wish that you were all like me, or I'm going to give my judgment on this. He's trying to give good advice for reasons that may not make complete sense to us, but did make sense to him and others because they were living at a certain, in a certain context. They're at Corinth, they're here with Timothy. We may not be aware of every reason that prompted Paul to say what he said. But my exegetical observation is here. He uses the first person, which means he's giving personal advice. Now, I can do that all day long. I can take some other point of the passage and argue for a totally different view. And this is the problem with 1 Timothy 2. It's the problem with the women in ministry issue. At any given point, I could argue either side of these questions pretty clearly and pretty effectively, again, using the text as my touch point, not caring about gender issues, feminine issues, this or that group, this or that ministry that takes this or that position. Don't care about any of that. Again, the question is what can the text sustain? And depending on what you emphasize in your exegesis, you can come down at different points and still build an exegetical argument on either side. And for those who are interested in this, you can go back and look at the exchange between myself and John. Again, his job was not to convert me. His job was to make me care enough about taking a position. And like I said, he failed, but it was fun. There's just, I can't say it any other way. I really don't feel that it's a good use of my time, and that I should really be pontificating too heavily on an issue that really there's in this one there's 3 or 4 points, there's 3 or 4 passages that will make the issue turn in one direction or the other. And the honest thing to say is that it could go either way because there's ambiguity built up in the text. It's just there. You'd have to be omniscient to really sort this one out. That's the most honest thing I can say. If you want to use the prophecy thing as an analogy, like the rapture, are you a splitter or a joiner? When it comes to descriptions of the Lord's return, should we put them in 2 piles or 1? You put them in 2 piles, you have a rapture and a second coming. You put them in 1, you got 1 event. Which one is the right answer? I don't know. I just don't know. I can build an argument for either one and have it look wonderful and elegant. But at the end of the day, I have to tell you that I am landing here because I just decided to emphasize this over that. And that's what you got with the women in issue. It's what you have with 1 Timothy 2. And by the way, we didn't even get to the last part of the passage, the whole thing about she shall be saved through childbearing. That's a whole separate issue. This passage would take a whole, I would say probably 2 or 3 episodes of the podcast to just sort of navigate the waters, through this passage. And of course, since this is 1 Timothy 2, the whole wider issue of how you'd argue the women's issue in either direction. That would take probably 3 podcast episodes. But for those of you who that might sound like good news, I would say don't expect that anytime soon, because we are about to start into a new book study. And again, I care about that, honestly, the book study, more than I care about this issue. At least that's where I'm at right now.